10 R&B legends you've probably never heard of. They had #1 hits, gold and platinum records, sold-out tours. Some of their songs never left radio movies or playlists. Yet most people today couldn't name the artists who created them. This isn't a story about forgotten music, it's about forgotten credit. About how the industry celebrates the sound but erases the source. Today we're uncovering 10 R&B legends you were never taught to remember. If you value truth over nostalgia, stay with us. Subscribe to Legends of Black Excellence, because history only survives when someone refuses to let it disappear. Bloodstone. Bloodstone entered the R&B landscape at a moment when soul music was quietly reinventing itself. Originating in Kansas City and later gaining momentum in London, the group emerged with a sound that resisted easy classification. In 1973, their breakthrough single Natural High climbed to number 10 on both the Billboard Hot 100 and the R&B chart, a significant accomplishment that placed them among the elite of their era. The accompanying album earned gold certification and later reached platinum, confirming that Bloodstone's success was not niche, it was national. What set Bloodstone apart was not volume or bravado, but emotional discipline. Their music unfolded slowly, built on layered harmonies, orchestral textures, and a sense of vulnerability rarely emphasized in mainstream soul at the time. While many contemporaries leaned toward high-energy funk or radio-friendly formulas, Bloodstone chose atmosphere. Their songs didn't demand attention. They invited listeners in. This artistic choice earned them respect among peers and led to performances alongside figures like Marvin Gaye and Curtis Mayfield, artists who also understood the power of emotional restraint. Yet the music industry has never been kind to subtlety. As the 1970s progressed, commercial priorities shifted toward disco rhythms, brighter production, and later harder-edged funk. Bloodstone's introspective approach no longer aligned with what labels aggressively promoted. They continued to record and tour into the late 1970s and 1980s, but the machinery that once amplified their presence had moved on. Their decline was not marked by scandal or failure, only by silence. If success is measured by charts, what happens to artists when charts stop measuring what they create? Time, however, had other plans. Natural High refused to fade. Decades later, the song re-entered popular consciousness through its placement in Jackie Brown, reaching audiences who had no memory of the original era. The melody, mood, and emotional weight still resonated, proving that the song had aged better than the system that once sidelined its creators. Ironically, many listeners embraced the track without learning the name Bloodstone, reinforcing a recurring pattern in R&B history. The music survives while its authors remain obscured. In 2019, Bloodstone received a Lifetime Achievement Award, an acknowledgement that arrived long after their commercial peak. It was meaningful, but also quietly symbolic, a recognition offered after the industry had already turned the page. For longtime fans, it confirmed what had always been known: Bloodstone mattered. Their legacy is not defined by how long they stayed visible, but by how deeply their work continues to connect. Natural High remains a cornerstone of quiet storm radio late-night playlists and cinematic storytelling because it speaks in a language that does not expire. Bloodstone created music rooted in feeling, not fashion. They were not forgotten because they lacked impact. They were overlooked because the industry rarely protects artists who move at their own pace. The Sylvers. The Sylvers were never an industry experiment. They were a real family, navigating a business that rarely makes room for intimacy. Formed in Los Angeles, the group consisted of 10 siblings raised in a musical household, each trained to sing, harmonize, and perform from an early age. By the mid-1970s, their chemistry translated into a sound that felt effortless yet precise, youthful but disciplined. In 1976, everything aligned when Boogie Fever exploded onto radio, reaching #1 on the Billboard R&B chart and number 15 on the Hot 100, becoming one of the most recognizable songs of the decade. Boogie Fever wasn't just a hit, it was a cultural moment. The track dominated dance floors, television appearances, and summer playlists, defining an era when funk still felt communal rather than manufactured. The Sylvers followed with songs like Hotline and High School Dance, maintaining strong chart presence and confirming that their success wasn't accidental. Yet being a family act came with challenges few groups faced. Creative decisions affected not just careers, but relationships. Touring schedules collided with personal growth. Contracts negotiated for one affected all 10. As disco began to wane and the late 1970s gave way to a more fragmented music market, sustaining momentum became increasingly difficult. The Sylvers continued recording into the early 1980s, but the industry's appetite shifted quickly. Youth-oriented acts were often treated as disposable, and family groups were expected to preserve an image that no longer reflected reality. Unlike solo artists, the Sylvers could not easily reinvent themselves without disrupting the collective identity that made them famous. Eventually, the spotlight dimmed. The Sylvers did not collapse in scandal or creative failure. They simply outgrew the narrow lane the industry assigned them. Members pursued individual paths, and the group gradually stepped away from active touring. For years, their name receded into nostalgia, remembered primarily through Boogie Fever, often reduced to a single-song legacy despite a deeper catalog. Then came an unexpected revival. In the late 2010s and early 2020s, platforms like TikTok introduced Boogie Fever and How Love Hurts to younger audiences who encountered the music without context or preconceptions. What had once been framed as old school suddenly felt fresh again. The groove translated effortlessly across generations, proving that the song's appeal was rooted in feel, not fashion. Today, the Sylvers are no longer a touring act, but their music has reclaimed relevance in an organic way. There was no rebrand, no calculated comeback, just rediscovery. Their story illustrates a broader truth about R&B history. Many artists didn't disappear because they lacked talent or audience connection. They disappeared because the industry moved on before they were allowed to evolve. The Sylvers weren't a trend. They were a family whose music survived the moment that tried to define them. Con Funk Shun. Con Funk Shun built their reputation the hard way on stage, city by city, long before mainstream America ever noticed. Formed in Vallejo, California in 1969, the group spent years refining a sound that balanced funk's physical energy with R&B's melodic discipline. By the mid-1970s, that work paid off. Signed to Mercury Records, Con Funk Shun became a fixture on black radio, delivering records that consistently connected with audiences who valued groove musicianship and emotional clarity. Their commercial breakthrough arrived in 1978 with Fun, which reached #1 on the Billboard R&B chart. The song was more than a hit. It was a declaration. Funk wasn't just a style. It was a culture, a community, and a feeling. Follow-up singles like Too Tight, Chase Me, and Love's Train reinforced their presence, earning gold certifications and filling venues nationwide. Yet despite this success, crossover recognition remained limited. Only Fun and Too Tight briefly entered the Billboard Hot 100, revealing a persistent divide between R&B dominance and pop validation. What distinguished Con Funk Shun was consistency. Over the course of a decade, they released 11 albums, maintained a loyal fan base, and toured relentlessly. Their live performances were known for precision, rather than spectacle-tight rhythms, controlled vocals, and arrangements that prioritized movement over flash. This commitment made them essential within R&B circles, even if it kept them outside the industry's broader marketing focus. As the 1980s progressed, internal pressures mounted. Creative differences, business tensions, and the natural strain of constant touring eventually led to a breakup in 1986. There was no dramatic implosion, just exhaustion and separation. For years afterward, Kan Funk Shun existed largely as a memory, names on vinyl sleeves, and radio playlists curated by devoted fans who never stopped listening. Why is sustained excellence often rewarded with silence rather than celebration? Decades later, validation arrived from an unexpected place. In 2022, Love's Train was covered by Silk Sonic, the duo formed by Bruno Mars and Anderson .Paak. The reinterpretation introduced Kan Funk Shun's music to a new generation and reignited interest in their catalog. Venues that had never booked the group before suddenly called. Festivals opened their stages. Surviving members reunited performing for audiences many years younger than the songs themselves. The revival was bittersweet. Some original members were no longer alive to witness the renewed appreciation. Yet the moment proved something essential. Kan Funk Shun's music had not aged, it had waited. The groove still worked, the lyrics still resonated, the craftsmanship still mattered. Kan Funk Shun didn't disappear because they lacked relevance. They stepped aside while trends shifted, and decades later, the music quietly reclaimed its place. Lakeside. Lakeside did not arrive as overnight stars. Formed in Dayton, Ohio in 1969, the group spent much of the 1970s navigating label changes, lineup shifts, and the uncertainty that defines most working bands. Dayton was a fertile funk city home to groups like Ohio Players and Slave, but competition was fierce and attention was limited. For years, Lakeside remained talented but unestablished, refining a sound built on tight rhythm sections, polished harmonies, and dance floor instincts. Everything changed in 1980. Fantastic Voyage reached #1 on the Billboard R&B chart, becoming the defining record of their career. The album earned gold certification and later went platinum, selling over 1 million copies. More than a commercial success, the song captured a precise cultural moment. Its groove was sleek but not sterile, celebratory without excess, and accessible across age groups. Fantastic Voyage quickly became a staple at parties, clubs, and radio stations nationwide. Success, however, has a narrow window. Lakeside continued releasing albums throughout the early and mid-1980s, scoring moderate R&B hits, such as Raid and Outrageous. While these records maintained the group's credibility, none matched the cultural saturation of Fantastic Voyage. As musical tastes shifted toward new jack swing and emerging hip-hop production, the sound that had elevated Lakeside began to feel increasingly out of step with industry priorities. The irony of Lakeside's story lies in the endurance of that one record. In 1994, Fantastic Voyage found new life when it was heavily sampled by Coolio for his own hit of the same name, introducing the groove to an entirely new generation. The song continued to circulate through commercials, films, and video games, including Grand Theft Auto San Andreas. Millions recognized the rhythm without knowing its origin. Lakeside's influence expanded even as their name faded from casual conversation. Unlike many groups from their era, Lakeside never officially disbanded. They continued performing in various lineups, preserving the music for audiences who remembered the original moment and those discovering it later. Yet public memory often reduced the group to a single achievement, overlooking the years of work that preceded and followed it. Lakeside's story is not one of missed potential. It is a reflection of how pop history simplifies complex careers. Fantastic Voyage remains timeless, not because it was repeated endlessly, but because it was executed perfectly when timing, talent, and culture aligned. The song did exactly what music is supposed to do. It lasted. Lakeside didn't fail to evolve. The industry simply moved faster than it was willing to remember where the journey began. Mtume. Mtume occupied a rare position in R&B history, simultaneously at the center of innovation and at the margins of public recognition. The group was led by James Mtume, a musician whose roots were not confined to commercial soul. Before forming Mtume, he worked in jazz circles, collaborating with Miles Davis during the Electric Fusion era, where experimentation mattered more than chart placement. That background shaped Mtume's later work, precise, spacious, and emotionally controlled. By the early 1980s, Mtume had crystallized a sound that felt ahead of its time. In 1983, the group released Juicy Fruit, a record that blended minimalist funk synthesizer-driven textures and restrained vocals into something quietly irresistible. The song spent 8 consecutive weeks at #1 on the Billboard R&B chart and sold over 1 million copies, becoming one of the defining tracks of the decade. Unlike many dance records of the era, Juicy Fruit thrived on restraint. The groove was skeletal but powerful, leaving space for atmosphere rather than excess. Mtume followed with You, Me, and He, another R&B hit that reinforced their presence within the Quiet Storm format. Yet despite chart success, mainstream crossover remained limited. Mtume's music asked listeners to lean in rather than react instantly, a quality that resonated deeply within Black radio, but proved harder to market beyond it. The group continued recording through the mid-1980s, but the industry's appetite was shifting rapidly toward louder production and more image-driven acts. When a song becomes bigger than its creator, who gets remembered the voice or the echo it leaves behind? That question became unavoidable in 1994 when Juicy Fruit was sampled for Juicy, the breakthrough hit by the Notorious B.I.G. The sample introduced the groove to millions of new listeners, many of whom never learned its origin. The song achieved cultural immortality, but Mtume's name receded further into the background. This wasn't plagiarism or erasure. It was the natural consequence of an industry that rewards reinvention more than acknowledgement. As Mtume, the group, dissolved, James Mtume redirected his creative energy. He became a prolific songwriter and producer, co-writing The Closer I Get to You, Back Together Again, and Stephanie Mills's Never Knew Love Like This Before, a song that won a Grammy Award. Beyond music, he emerged as a prominent activist and radio voice, using his platform to challenge industry power structures and cultural inequities. His influence expanded even as his visibility as a performer diminished. Mtume's legacy cannot be measured solely by chart positions. It exists in the architecture of modern R&B and hip-hop, in the way space, rhythm, and emotion are allowed to coexist. Juicy Fruit remains a staple not because it was repeated endlessly, but because it introduced a language other artists continue to speak. Mtume did not disappear. The music simply moved forward, carrying his blueprint often without saying his name. The New Birth. The New Birth were never meant to be ordinary. At the dawn of the 1970s, when most R&B groups were trimming down to fit radio formats, the New Birth expanded in the opposite direction. Conceived by producer and former Motown figure Harvey Fuqua after his departure from the label, the project brought together an ambitious musical ecosystem. A core band, the Nightlighters, multiple vocal groups and soloists operating as one unified entity. At its peak, the New Birth functioned as a 17-member collective, an audacious idea in an industry already wary of managing smaller acts. Their recorded debut arrived in 1971 with It's Been a Long Time, an album that reimagined pop and rock material through a richly layered soul lens. Covers like Bread's Make It With You were transformed into expansive arrangements where voices operated like instruments, weaving orchestration, harmony, and rhythm into something cinematic. This was not background music, it demanded attention. For a brief period, the New Birth felt like a vision of where R&B could go if freed from commercial restraint. Throughout the early 1970s, the collective released a steady run of albums that emphasized depth over immediacy. Their music balanced gospel intensity, funk undercurrents, and symphonic ambition, often stretching songs beyond conventional structures. Critics admired the innovation, and musicians took note, but sustaining such a large ensemble proved increasingly difficult. Touring logistics. Financial strain and creative coordination placed constant pressure on the group's foundation. As the decade progressed, the challenges became impossible to ignore. Maintaining cohesion among so many members, each with distinct voices, priorities, and personal lives, tested the limits of any organizational model. Lineups shifted, subgroups departed, The identity that once felt revolutionary began to fragment. While the New Birth continued recording into the mid-1970s, the original spark that made the collective feel unstoppable gradually dimmed. Unlike groups undone by scandal or sudden failure, the New Birth faded through complexity. Their vision was simply too large for an industry optimized for efficiency. Radio favored concise singles. Labels preferred predictable branding. A sprawling collective offering layered experimentation was a hard sell in a market moving toward precision. Today, the New Birth often exists as a footnote, a fascinating what-if rather than a fully explored legacy. Yet their recordings remain strikingly modern. The arrangements still breathe. The harmonies still surprise. What once felt excessive now sounds bold. Their work anticipated later movements in R&B and soul that embraced collaboration, fusion, and scale. The New Birth did not lack talent or purpose. They lacked an industry willing to grow with them. Their story is a reminder that innovation does not always fail because it is flawed. Sometimes it fails because it arrives before the system is ready to support it. The New Birth weren't forgotten because they aimed too high. They were left behind because they refused to aim smaller. Atlantic Starr. Atlantic Starr were never short on talent, but their story reveals how success can become both a reward and a restraint. Formed in New York in the mid-1970s, the group was built around strong musicianship and layered vocals rather than image-driven hype. From the beginning, Atlantic Starr aimed for polish and emotional clarity, crafting songs that favored melody balance and restraint. By the early 1980s, they had become reliable chart performers within the R&B world, steadily building an audience that trusted their sound. Their defining moment arrived in 1987 with Always. The song reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, crossed over internationally, and became one of the most recognizable ballads of the decade. Unlike many pop hits, Always was understated. No explosive chorus, no dramatic shifts, just sincerity carried by disciplined vocals and a simple arrangement. It quickly became a staple at weddings, anniversaries, and slow dances, embedding itself into personal milestones rather than fleeting trends. Yet crossover success carries expectations. After Always, Atlantic Starr faced intense pressure to repeat the formula. Labels and radio favored familiarity, leaving little room for experimentation or evolution. The group continued recording through the late 1980s and early 1990s, releasing solid material that resonated with loyal listeners. But the cultural moment that had elevated Always could not be recreated on demand. As R&B tastes shifted toward new jack swing and later hip-hop influenced production, Atlantic Starr's smooth romantic approach was gradually labeled as outdated rather than timeless. When a single song becomes your public identity, how do you grow without erasing what made people care in the first place? Lineup changes further complicated the group's trajectory. While Atlantic Starr remained, active changes in vocalists and internal dynamics subtly altered their chemistry. These transitions did not diminish their professionalism, but they made it harder to sustain the emotional continuity audiences associated with the group's peak era. Over time, Atlantic Starr's presence narrowed from mainstream visibility to a more specialized appreciation among R&B fans. Despite this shift, their influence never disappeared. Always continued to circulate across generations, introduced by parents, DJs, and quiet storm radio. The song's longevity demonstrated a truth often overlooked by chart metrics: music tied to life's most intimate moments rarely fades completely. While newer artists dominated playlists, Atlantic Starr's work endured in spaces where emotional memory matters more than trend alignment. Atlantic Starr's legacy is often reduced to one iconic record, but that simplification misses the broader picture. They represented a version of R&B rooted in elegance, patience, and emotional honesty, qualities that do not always thrive in fast-moving markets. Their career illustrates how being excellent is not always enough to remain visible when the industry prioritizes reinvention over continuity. Atlantic Starr didn't lose relevance because their music stopped working. They lost the spotlight because the industry stopped listening for subtlety. Charles Wright and the Watts, 103rd Street Rhythm Band. Charles Wright and the Watts. 103rd Street Rhythm Band represented a different kind of R&B legacy, one built on repetition, discipline, and community rather than stardom. Formed in Los Angeles in the late 1960s, the group emerged directly from the streets of Watts, a neighborhood still marked by the aftermath of the 1965 uprising. Their music reflected that environment, grounded, unapologetic, and rooted in rhythm above all else. There was no polish meant for crossover appeal. This was funk, designed to move bodies and speak plainly. Their breakthrough came in 1970 with Express Yourself, a record that became an enduring anthem. Built on a relentless groove rather than a traditional song structure, the track climbed the charts and embedded itself into American culture. Unlike many hits of the era, Express Yourself didn't rely on lyrical complexity or vocal fireworks. Its power came from repetition bass guitar drums locking into a hypnotic cycle that felt almost meditative. The song encouraged self-definition through rhythm, an idea that resonated deeply within Black communities. Charles Wright led the band with a working man's mentality. The Watts 103rd Street Rhythm Band didn't chase trends or adjust their sound for mass consumption. They favored extended grooves that bordered on redundancy, but never quite crossed it. Songs like "Your Love Means Everything to Me" showed a softer dimension, yet even these moments remained anchored in rhythm-first thinking. Their music prioritized feel over flair, consistency over spectacle. That question became unavoidable as the decade progressed. While the band continued recording and performing, their refusal to adapt to shifting industry expectations limited their mainstream expansion. Yet history delivered an unexpected echo. In 1988, Express Yourself was sampled by NWA for a song of the same name, reintroducing the groove to a new generation. The connection ran deeper than music. Eazy-E, a central figure in NWA, was Charles Wright's nephew. Through hip-hop, the band's influence expanded far beyond its original reach. Ironically, many listeners associated the message and rhythm with the later version, unaware of its origin. This pattern repeated itself across decades. The sound endured while the source faded from public recognition. Charles Wright and the Watts, 103rd Street Rhythm Band, became a reference point respected by musicians, cited in liner notes, sampled by innovators, but rarely centered in popular retrospectives. The group never disappeared entirely. They continued performing in various configurations, preserving a catalog that remained remarkably intact over time. Their work aged well because it was never tied to fashion. It was tied to movement, to repetition, to the communal experience of groove. Their legacy challenges conventional measures of success. They were not a brand, a trend, or a crossover phenomenon. They were architects of rhythm, quietly shaping the foundation others would later build upon. Charles Wright and the Watts. 103rd Street Rhythm Band weren't forgotten because they lacked impact. They were overlooked because their greatest contribution was too deeply embedded in the culture to carry a spotlight. The Chi-Lites. The Chi-Lites emerged from Chicago with a sound that felt instantly familiar yet quietly elevated. Formed in the late 1960s, the group blended smooth vocal harmonies with narratives that leaned into vulnerability, regret, and emotional reflection. Their approach stood apart from the raw urgency of Southern soul or the polished machinery of Motown. Chicago soul was subtler, more conversational, and the Chi-Lites became its most recognizable voice. Their commercial breakthrough arrived in 1972 with "Oh Girl," a song that reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 and #1 on the R&B chart. It was a rare crossover achievement, driven not by spectacle, but by emotional honesty, built around a delicate harmonica line and restrained vocals. "Oh Girl" resonated because it sounded like a confession rather than a performance. The follow-up, "Have You Seen Her," also reached the top of both charts, confirming that the group was not a one-song phenomenon, but a defining force of the era. What made the Chi-Lites distinctive was songwriting perspective. Their lyrics often explored male vulnerability at a time when R&B masculinity leaned toward dominance or bravado. Songs centered on loss, accountability, and longing emotions many listeners recognized but rarely heard articulated so plainly. Musically, the group favored clean arrangements that left space for harmony to breathe. Nothing felt rushed. Nothing felt forced. As the 1970s progressed, however, the musical landscape shifted. Disco's rise changed radio priorities, favoring rhythm over reflection and tempo over tenderness. The Chi-Lites continued recording and performing, but chart momentum slowed. Lineup changes added further instability, subtly altering the chemistry audiences associated with their earlier work. While they never stopped making quality music, the industry's attention moved elsewhere. When music speaks softly, does it get lost once the room gets louder? Over time, public memory narrowed. The Chi-Lites became widely associated with just two songs, Oh Girl and Have You Seen Her, despite a catalog that extended far beyond those hits. This reduction to one-hit wonder status misrepresented their contribution, overlooking how deeply they influenced the development of romantic soul and quiet storm R&B. Their harmonies, phrasing, and lyrical openness became templates for later artists, even if credit was rarely given. Their songs endured because they were tied to human experience rather than trend cycles. Oh Girl continued to appear in films, television, and personal playlists, often introduced by parents to children as emotional time capsules. The music aged gracefully because it never relied on production gimmicks that date quickly. It relied on feeling. The Chi-Lites' legacy is not about chart longevity, it is about emotional accuracy. They captured moments people recognized in their own lives and gave those moments melody. While history often compresses their story into a single chapter, the group's influence stretches quietly across decades of R&B. The Chi-Lites didn't disappear because they ran out of things to say. They stepped out of the spotlight because the industry stopped listening for nuance. The Gap Band. The Gap Band came from a place most people never associated with funk stardom. Formed in Tulsa, Oklahoma by brothers Charlie Ronnie and Robert Wilson, the group carried their city's history into their name, Greenwood Archer and Pine Streets, tied to the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. It was a deliberate choice, anchoring their music in Black memory while delivering grooves meant to move crowds. From the start, the Gap Band sounded unapologetic raw rhythm, heavy bass, sharp horns, and vocals built for call and response energy. Their rise accelerated in the early 1980s with a string of R&B hits that dominated Black radio. Songs like You Dropped a Bomb on Me, Outstanding Early in the Morning, and Party Train became club essentials. While these records did not always crack the top 20 on the Billboard Hot 100, they performed powerfully on the R&B charts and in live settings where the Gap Band's sound truly lived. Their music was physical engineered for dance floors rather than crossover acceptance. What distinguished the Gap Band was commitment to funk at a time when compromise often led to broader success. Their records leaned into repetition, syncopation, and minimal melodic distraction. The groove was the message. Charlie Wilson's vocal style, urgent, gritty, and conversational, cut through the mix without smoothing edges for pop consumption. This authenticity earned loyalty, but it also limited mainstream expansion in an industry that increasingly favored polish over pulse. As the decade progressed, the musical landscape shifted. New jack swing, digital production, and hip-hop began reshaping radio priorities. The Gap Band continued releasing material into the late 1980s and early 1990s, but the industry's appetite had changed. Their sound, once essential, was now labeled old school before its creators had a chance to evolve within the mainstream framework. Ironically, their influence only grew. Hip-hop producers repeatedly sampled the Gap Band's catalog, particularly Outstanding, introducing their grooves to younger audiences worldwide. The rhythms lived on in new forms, embedded in records that topped charts and defined eras. Yet many listeners recognized the beat without knowing its source. The music became foundational while the group's name drifted into specialist knowledge rather than popular recall. The Gap Band never lacked relevance, they lacked protection. Their work represented a version of black funk that refused dilution. While others crossed over, the Gap Band stayed rooted. Their songs aged well because they were built on rhythm rather than trend. DJs still reach for their records when energy matters more than nostalgia. Their story challenges how success is measured. They sold records, filled venues, and shaped the soundscape that followed. If history remembers them less loudly, it's not because they failed to connect, but because they never asked permission to be themselves. The Gap Band didn't disappear. They became the backbone of a culture that kept dancing long after the spotlight moved on. These artists weren't footnotes. They topped charts, sold millions of records, and shaped the sound that later generations built entire careers on. Yet today, many people recognize the samples, the movie scenes, or the cover versions without knowing the original names. So the question isn't whether these R&B legends mattered. The question is why history allowed them to fade while others were elevated. Was it timing, marketing, crossover politics, or something deeper about how Black excellence is archived? At Legends of Black Excellence, we ask you, who decides which legends are remembered and which are quietly erased?